I would like to welcome everyone. I think this is now recording. Spotlighted video won't be recorded. You're recording. All right. It said spotlighted video won't be. We'll find out. It says that we're recording now. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first seminar and I guess the launch event for the Center for Continental Philosophy at Royal Holloway. The first speaker being Henry Summers Hall, who fittingly is the first speaker since he was the one who put so much effort into setting this up, which included all of the head-banging dealing with the college itself to get this center approved. But it was approved, I think, shortly before the lockdown, and then everyone having to switch to online and hybrid teaching. So it's beginning a bit later than we had originally planned, but it's good that it's up now. This is the first of 3 seminars this term, and I take it, Henry, there's going to be some in the summer term as well, is the plan?
Yeah, so the plan is we'll have another 3 seminars.
Okay. Okay, so the 3 are today, and then I'm the next one up, and then Rebecca Bamford, I'm in 2 weeks. I think Rebecca Bamford is in 2 weeks after that. So that information will be circulated in due course. As I say, we're recording this now. We'll just record the talk rather than the Q&A. People, when it comes to the Q&A, are welcome to signal by putting a question into the chat or by using the hand raising function. And I'll try in either case to try and keep it in order of people who ask. The whole session will be about an hour and a half. Henry's talk, I guess, 40 to 45 minutes, if I'm right.
Yeah, somewhere between 40 and an hour.
Okay, so just to do the introductions, Henry Summers Hall is a reader in philosophy at our institution, Royal Holloway, University of London. He's the author of Hegel, Deleuze, and the Critique of Representation, published in 2012. Author of Deleuze's Difference and Repetition, the Edinburgh University Press Guide in 2013. He's the co-editor, Daniel Smith, of the Cambridge Companion to Deleuze, and with Jeff Bell and James Williams of the EUP reader, 1,000 Plateaus in Philosophy, and is also the author of a forthcoming book, Judgment and Sense in Modern French Philosophy, from a minor and unimportant press called Cambridge University Press. And I'd like to welcome Henry to his own center, his own first talk at his own center. The title of the talk today is Sartre's Hidden Bergsonism, the Logic of Multiplicities of Sartre's Early Work.
Okay, thanks for that, Nathan. Okay, well, I'll just jump in then. So in an interview, Hubert Dreyfus writes of Sartre that he started out as a Husserlian, then he read Heidegger and was converted to what he thought was Heideggerian existentialism. But as a Husserlian and a Frenchman, he felt he had to fix up Heidegger and make him more Cartesian. When that is Hubert Dreyfus, visited Heidegger, he had Being and Nothingness on his desk in German translation. And I said, "So you're reading Sartre?" And he responded, "How can I even begin to read this shit?" Now that's pretty strong, says Dreyfus, but I think accurate. Now, obviously it's not impossible to notice the influence of Heidegger on Being and Nothingness, but in this paper I want to counterbalance that influence by drawing out some of the Bergsonian influences on Sartre's thoughts. So I want to begin by highlighting the central characteristics of Bergson's early work, Time and Free Will, which is his logic of multiplicities. And having done that, I'm going to focus on Sartre's early works on the imagination, where Sartre employs Bergson's line of argument against traditional accounts of the imagination, while holding that Bergson himself fails to fully extricate himself from this tradition. What I want to do then is argue that Bergson's theory of the 2 multiplicities lies at the heart of Sartre's positive account of the imagination, and that the implications of this Bergsonian heritage can be found at play in the formulation of his account of freedom in Being and Nothingness. And I'll talk a little bit about Deleuze and Guattari at the end as well, very briefly. Okay, so to begin with Bergson then. At the heart of Bergson's early account of consciousness is a natural illusion, whereby we assimilate temporal phenomena to a spatial mode of understanding. Now, in doing so, we misapprehend both the nature of the elements that make up our experience and the connections between those elements. So in order to explain this process of abstraction and translation, Bergson presents the case of counting as a paradigmatic case of this kind of spatialization of experience. So counting involves bringing together a collection of entities, but also bringing them together in a particular way. Now, Bergson notes that given a collection of entities, we could enumerate the members of this group by taking a register rather than counting them directly. Now, doing this would be to give a list of everyone on this chat, for instance. But that wouldn't give us a total. If we just had a list of people, we wouldn't have a total. To arrive at a total, we need to leave to one side the fact that each individual is different and treat each element as identical to each other. So to use Bergson's example, he says, we count sheep in a flock and say there are 50, although they are all different from one another and are easily recognized by the shepherd. But the reason is that we agree in that case to neglect their individual differences and to take into account only what they have in common. So to actually move from a collection of individuals to a summation, we need to represent time as a line upon which the different objects, the sheep in Bergson's example, are placed at regular intervals. So when we view time as a line, we're effectively able to juxtapose the elements that make up number and then come to a total. So what makes counting possible in this case is a representation of time borrowed from space. So seeing time as a line allows us to conceive of time as a container in which various elements are essentially discrete units, much as we see objects in spaces juxtaposed and separated from one another by being in different positions in a homogeneous medium. So what allows us to count, therefore, is not for Bergson successions of moments in time as it is for Kant, but the representation of that succession within a spatial milieu. As Bergson puts it, when we're adding up units, we're not dealing with these moments themselves, but with the lasting traces which they seem to have left in space on their passage through it. So if we understand the world in these terms, on the basis of this representation of time as spatial, then we bring into the world a number of characteristics. First, time is here going to be seen as a container for events, just as homogeneous space is a container for objects. So time will be that within which moments are juxtaposed. Second, understanding the mind in spatial terms allows us to see mental states as quantifiable. So we can make sense of ideas such as an increasing sense of joy, for instance, if we understand our mental lives in spatial terms. So understanding the world in terms of a multiplicity of elements within a homogeneous space allows us to either ideally or physically bring these bodies into relation with one another to compare their magnitudes. Third, understanding the world in spatial terms allows us to separate the world into clearly defined elements. So these elements are related to one another and distinguished from one another by being placed in a homogeneous medium. So if you put things in space, you can kind of form a group of them, but you can also separate them out because they have different positions. So such an ability to conceive of elements distinctly is the foundation for the kind of analysis we find, for instance, in the work of Descartes. And in his Reguli, for instance, he says that problems should be re-expressed in terms of the real extension of bodies and should be pictured in our imagination entirely by means of bare figures. Thus, they will be perceived more distinctly by the intellect. So once we're able to distinguish the parts from one another, we're able to solve problems by breaking them up into distinct components without really needing to worry that such a process will change the nature of what's analysed. Finally, or fourth rather, an analysis in terms of a homogeneous material precludes the possibility of genuine novelty for Bergson. So Bergson argues that insofar as we see a system as defined in terms of a collection of discrete elements within a homogeneous milieu, then what appear to be novel states are simply different relations between parts that in theory are reversible. Okay, so that's the first multiplicity, a spatial multiplicity. Now Bergson contrasts that with what he calls a confused multiplicity, which is going to be the kind of multiplicity initially of mental states and then of the way in which time operates. So if we accept this claim from Bergson that we typically understand our mental states in spatial terms, then there's a natural question that arises. If we normally think in terms of a representation of conscious experience, then what is the conscious experience that underlies that representation? So it's difficult for Bergson to actually talk about what experience is, because he thinks that language also tends to represent the world in spatial terms. But there is a clear counterpoint in Time and Free Will to this analysis of counting in terms of space. So here's what he says. While I'm writing these lines, the hour strikes on a neighbouring clock, but my inattentive ear does not perceive it until several strokes have made themselves heard. Hence, I have not counted them, and yet I only have to turn my attention backwards to count up the 4 strokes which have already sounded and add them to those which I hear. If then I question myself on what has just taken place, I perceive that the first 4 sounds had struck my ears and even affected my consciousness, but that the sensations produced by each one of them, instead of being set side by side, had melted into one another in such a way as to give the whole a peculiar quality, to make a kind of musical phrase out of it. In order then to estimate retrospectively the number of strokes sounded, I tried to reconstruct this phrase in thought. My imagination made 1 stroke, 2, then 3. As long as it did not reach the exact number 4, my feeling, when consulted, answered that the total effect was qualitatively different. So counting involves a juxtaposition of entities within a homogeneous space. But the elements we find in our conscious life for Bergson instead interpenetrate each other. So when Bergson here starts attending to the sound of the clock, the previous strokes are still present within the sensation of the 4th. So rather than the sensations being distinct entities in a homogeneous space, the first stroke is contained in the perception of the final stroke, and it changes the nature of that final perception. As Bergson notes, this shows that our mental life can't be mapped out in the same way that physical objects are mapped out. So one of our central assumptions about a spatial mode of organisation is that 2 bodies can't occupy the same space at the same time. Here, however, we've got an example of a kind of interpenetrative structure where mental states are simply incompatible with the kind of geometrical analysis that Descartes proposes. So it's a very different way of analysing things here. So for a spatial multiplicity, all of the possible divisions we could make in them are already present. So dividing numbers doesn't change the fundamental nature of them. In the case of the sensation of the clock striking, the quality of the multiplicity, and not just its extension, is governed by the number of elements. Changing the number of elements changes the nature of the multiplicity, as well as the nature of the elements themselves, because each sound retains the impression of the previous striking. So an implication of this is that rather than the elements simply being outside of one another as spatial objects are, the elements in a confused multiplicity define one another through their interrelations. As such, the unity of the elements isn't something we impose from the outside, but it's rather something intrinsic to them. Now, what this tells us is that we're dealing with a manifold that's constituted in a different manner from the discrete multiplicity we find in space. Given its interpenetrative nature, Bergson dubs this manifold a confused multiplicity. So counting might be the best way of understanding a discrete multiplicity, But the best way, the simplest example that Bergson uses of a confused multiplicity is that of melody. So each of the elements in a melody form an organic unity rather than simply being juxtaposed together. So rather than counting where the previous states are set alongside the present ones, if we listen to a melody, the notes can't be understood as distinct from each other, and they retain this past while opening onto future notes. So this notion comes to the fore in the fact that it's the melody as a whole that's affected by a mistake in the performance rather than an individual note. So as he says, if we interrupt the rhythm by dwelling longer than is right on one note of a tune, it's not the exaggerated length as length which will warn us of our mistake, but the qualitative change thereby caused in the whole of the musical phrase. So Bergson's claim, therefore, is that our mental life operates more like a melody than a spatial multiplicity, and different states meld into one another to form their unity. So what we've got in Bergson, therefore, is a logic of two kinds of multiplicity. One form of multiplicity, the discrete multiplicity, is organized in terms of entities that are separated off from one another and related through the medium of space. The other is a confused multiplicity where the elements are not distinct from one another and instead interpenetrate without the need of an external milieu in order to bring them into relation with one another. So Bergson claims that our experience of mental states is confused, is of a confused multiplicity, with the spatialization of experience, a form of illusion that allows us to bring to bear on our mental states the kind of quantitative tools that Descartes introduces. Okay, so that's the Bergson for now. So I now want to start bringing in a bit of Sartre into this paper. And I want to talk a little bit about the influence of Bergson on Sartre's criticism of earlier accounts of the imagination to start with. So at the heart of Bergson's account of our mental life is the claim that we tend to suffer from a natural illusion through which we fail to recognize a difference in kind between the way our mental lives are organized and the way in which the external world is organized. Now, in opening his account of the imagination, Sartre writes that existence as imaged is a mode of being quite difficult to grasp. Grasping it requires some straining of the mind, but above all, it requires us to get rid of our almost unbreakable habit of construing all modes of existence on the model of physical existence. So the result of this habit, which is very Bergsonian, I think, is that we tend to understand the image in the same terms as the perceived object. Both are, in effect, objects we seem to discover within the mind that may or may not relate to the external world. So when I close my eyes and bring to mind the image of this piece of paper that I've just been inspecting, then I fall into a natural illusion that the image has the same properties as the object itself and exists like the object itself, although perhaps in an inferior manner. So this pure a priori theory, as Sartre calls it, makes a thing out of the image and conflicts with the data of intuition, which suggests that there's a difference in kind between objects of the imagination and objects of perception. So in order to resolve this conflict, we develop a new theoretical model of the relationship between mental states and their objects. So we accommodate our intuitions here by holding that the image is a thing just as much a thing as it is an image of, but by the very fact that it's an image, it receives a sort of metaphysical inferiority in comparison with the thing it represents. In a word, as Sartre says, the image is a lesser thing. So what's the difference in kind between imagining and perceiving is accommodated into the classical account of the mind by reducing it to a difference in degree of existences. Now, the classic examples of this kind of model this kind of theoretical model would be those of Hume and Descartes. So Sartre notes that what he calls the illusion of imminence leads to a number of false problems, and we can see the influence of Bergson, I think, in Sartre's account of these false problems. So first, Sartre notes that once images are understood as passive objects within a spatialized consciousness, we can't understand images' characteristic distinctness from perception. So we feel that there's a difference in kind between images and perceptions, but an immanent understanding of consciousness, an understanding that these are both things within the mind, can only leave us probable the difference between them. So Hume's criterion for the distinction between impressions and ideas is the relative liveliness of each. Now, such a criterion doesn't provide a definitive way of distinguishing impressions and ideas. As Sartre says, why doesn't the image of the noise of a cannon blast appear like a weak but real creaking? So we might try and follow Descartes in giving a more explicit role for judgment in distinguishing perceptions and ideas, but this, according to Sartre, isn't plausible either. So he notes that such an account is once again phenomenologically false, not only because it can only once again give us a probable account of the difference between perceptions and ideas, but because it misrepresents the fact that we have an immediate recognition of the difference between perceptions and imaginings. So he says, at each instant there arises around us a multitude of little strange incidents, objects that move by themselves in appearance, that creak and groan, appear or disappear, etc. All these fantastic events are explained upon reflection in the simplest way in the world. But at first pass, they should surprise us on this model. We should be, at least for an instant, tempted to rank them amongst images. So there's a problem with the fact that we can immediately distinguish impressions and imaginings that fits poorly with the idea that it's through a process of judgment or a difference in degree that we separate these. And this is a criticism that also, once again, is raised by Bergson in Matter and Memory. So Bergson argues that pure perception would take the form of a spatial multiplicity, but memory has the form of a confused multiplicity. So it's only by considering each to have a mode of organisation for Bergson that differs in kind, it's only by assigning a different multiplicity to each, that we can explain why we suffer no confusion distinguishing a perception from a memory. So Bergson argues that it's a precondition for a proper distinction of mental phenomena that we accept a logic of multiplicities. Now, in the later text, The Imaginary on the Imagination, Sartre once again reiterates Bergson's critique of another key notion, which is that of the associationist logic of resemblance. So Sartre asks how it is that we're able to see the musical performer Franquenet give an impersonation of Maurice Chevalier. So the question is how this small, stout brunette can imitate a man. Now, following Sartre's question, following Bergson, Sartre notes that supposing it's a resemblance that operates in this case to allow us to see Franquenet as the figure of Chevalier is problematic, since there are so few details shared between Franquenet and that of Chevalier. So in explaining how one's able to see Chevalier in the performance of Franquenet, Sartre explicitly cites with approval Bergson's claim from Matter and Memory that resemblance has to be seen as operating prior to the constitution of the entities that it brings into relation. So the kinds of discrete entities that the associationist account presupposes are, on this model, dependent on a prior confused multiplicity. So as such, once again, the notion that synthesis operates on objects in the mind is shown to be inadequate. Instead, Sartre follows Bergson in arguing that our mental lives cannot be understood as an activity performed on inert elements, but the images themselves have to be seen as syntheses. So in clearing the ground for his own account of the imagination, therefore, Sartre essentially takes up Bergson's criticisms of seeing consciousness as a spatial container for inert ideas. Now that's all fine, but the key question following from that then is, well, in what ways does Sartre not become a Bergsonian? In what way does Sartre differ from Bergson? And I think if we return to Bergson's early work, Time and Free Will, we can notice that the original French title is an essay on the immediate data of consciousness. That is, Bergson's concerned with structures within consciousness, at least in that early work, even if his account moves away from a spatialized vision of these structures. So while Bergson, for Sartre, develops a more sophisticated account of the image, this image is nonetheless understood within what Sartre would call an immanentist context. So this leads to a number of criticisms of Bergson from Sartre. First, while Bergson accuses Hume of only positing a difference in a difference in degree rather, between memory and perception. So Hume only has a difference of degree between memory and perception. Sartre claims that's also the case for Bergson. So in Matter and Memory, Bergson argues that pure memory and pure perception differ in kind in terms of their structure. But then he goes on to claim that de facto, perception always involves a mixture of perception and memory. Thus, while there's a distinction between memory and perception, it's not one that's actually present to consciousness itself, since the difference in kind is only one of tendency and is only actualized in a difference in degree. So Bergson fails to avoid his criticism of Hume. And similarly, Sartre contends that while Bergson is correct to understand images as syntheses, his adherence to an immanentist conception of thought leads him to conflate the process and the result of synthesis. So Bergson sometimes considers consciousness as a process of synthesis, whereas at other points he considers consciousness to be something more like the result of a process of synthesis. So Sartre says, one seeks in vain in Bergson a positive description of the intentionality which constitutes it. Such is indeed the constant ambiguity of Bergson's dynamism, melodic syntheses but without a synthetic act, organizations without an organizing power. So what we've got here is in fact more than just a simple rejection of Bergson though, because at many points what Sartre's doing is maintaining Bergson's accounts of experience while claiming that Bergson has fallen into a transcendental illusion in setting forward those accounts. So Sartre notes in the Transcendence of the Ego, for instance, that we do have an awareness of the self much as Bergson described. The me is given as an object, but the source of this object is the reflection of consciousness on itself. So as such, the ego is a result of synthesis rather than a cause. So while we take consciousness to be an emanation of our ego, Sartre claims that that's an illusion. And in fact, the ego is constituted from our intentional acts. So when we attempt to introspect, we discover an object composed of our tendencies, but this object is transcendent to consciousness rather than the source of consciousness. So that's a difference from Bergson, but nonetheless Sartre writes that when we do reflect on our ego structure, it has precisely the structure, to quote Sartre, that one may find in the famous interpenetrative multiplicity of Bergson. So the transcendence of the ego therefore presents this nuanced relation to Bergson, where Sartre accepts Bergson's descriptions of experience while rejecting the conclusions that Bergson draws from them. So for Sartre, while Bergson attempts to escape from the logic of things, ultimately the claim is going to be that even an interpenetrative multiplicity is still too thing-like. Bergsonian consciousness for Sartre is clearly in no way an act, it is a thing. So we still have the same problem for Sartre in Bergson as we had for classical accounts of consciousness. Okay. So Sartre's divergence from Bergson begins with his introduction of intentionality. But I think it's important to bear in mind here that Sartre's account of intentionality has got a very ambivalent relationship to Husserl's account, just as his account of synthesis has an ambivalent relationship to Bergson's account of consciousness. So Sartre's criticisms of traditional accounts of the imagination revolve around the claim that all or almost all have made the confusion between identity of essence and identity of existence. If we see images as things that consciousness relates to in the same way that it relates to sense data, then there's a natural tendency to claim that images have the same ontological status as perceptions. So this mistake arises from the failure to recognize that the imagination isn't a faculty of thing-like images contained within consciousness, but imagining is a way for consciousness to relate to an absent object. So to be able to imagine an object isn't to have an image of that object, but to have a rule by which we can intend towards it. In effect, therefore, perceiving and imagining an object are not two different objects of the same nature, but they're two acts of different natures that take the same object. So when I perceive something and I imagine it, these are two different ways of relating to an object. They're not two different things within my consciousness. So to use Sartre's example, if I turn my head away from this white piece of paper I'm looking at and fix my eyes on the walls of my office, then I can still relate to the paper through my imagination. And in doing so, it's the same paper that I relate to when I'm imagining it as when I'm looking at it. The sheet that appears to me at this moment has an identity of essence with that sheet I was looking at earlier. And by essence, I intend not only the structure, but also the very individuality. So rather than seeing consciousness as manipulating representations, we now view consciousness as relating to objects in the world. So as I say, what Sartre's doing here is he's taking up one of the central insights of Husserl, but this is still nonetheless refracted through the lens of Sartre's earlier Bergsonism. So Sartre's going to give 4 characteristics that form the basis of his distinction of the image from perception. And as we'll see, Sartre's Bergsonism runs through the way in which he creates this distinction. So the first is, just, as we've seen, that the image is not an inert element brought into synthesis, but it's a mode of synthesis by which the object is made present to consciousness. So perception and imagining, as well as conceiving of an object, all share the same object, even though the manner of synthesis is going to be different in different cases. Second, while perception and imagination both relate to objects, the imagination relates to an object as absent. This mode of relation is fundamentally different from perception. Now, in setting out the difference between perception and imagining, Sartre once again draws on Bergson, and he conceives of the two kinds of synthesis in play when we're understanding perceiving and imagining in terms of the two multiplicities of time and free will. So he says that when we intend towards an object of perception, we can note, he says, that the object of perception constantly overflows consciousness. So its essence is given by an infinity of relations it holds to the world around it. Now, a consequence of this is that in perception, as he says, one must learn objects as they unfold. So Sartre argues that this distinguishing feature of perception is that it must be lived. As with Bergson, and Sartre explicitly repeats Bergson's example of lived experience of needing to wait for the sugar to dissolve in water before making the sugar water. Now, in contrast to this, the imagination operates in terms of knowledge I have when I construct an image. If I imagine the Pantheon and attempt to count the number of pillars it has, I can only do so if I already know the number in advance. So no amount of scrutinizing the mental image will add to my knowledge. In a similar contrast to perception, mental images don't require spatial or temporal context. So he says, for a mental image, the smile of Pierre that I represent to myself at this moment is neither the smile of yesterday evening nor his smile of this morning. It is no longer a case of a concept, but of an irreal object that gathers in an invariable synthesis the diverse smiles that have endured and disappeared. Finally, whereas perception relates consciousness to the full duration of its object, when we imagine an object, the time of the object, according to Sartre, is similar to the spatialized time that Bergson describes in Time and Free Will, an essay on the immediate data of consciousness. So that's a direct quote. So when we imagine an object for Sartre, the temporality of that object is directly understood in terms of Sartre's model of spatialized time. And the reason for that is that the imagined object is complete. He says, I know where I'm going and what I want to produce. To this extent, when I imagine even when the image I produce is one of movement, it's always viewed from the point of view of completion. So imagining is a procedure like, as with Bergson's account of our representation of mental processes, that happens in retrospect and replaces succession with juxtaposition. So there's a sharp difference from Bergson here, though. Whereas for Bergson, the two multiplicities are tendencies within consciousness, for Sartre, they are actually two modes of consciousness's relation to an object. So the difference in kind between these multiplicities explains why we feel an immediate sense of certainty in discriminating images from perceptions. So the difference in kind between the two kinds of multiplicity provides the basis for Sartre's account of the two kinds of synthetic relationships to the world. The key difference between Sartre and Bergson here is that whereas for Bergson multiplicities are synthetic objects in the loosest possible sense, for Sartre they are synthetic relationships to objects. Okay, so that's the first two characteristics of images. The third characteristic of the imagination is that it posits its object as a nothingness. So perception relates to an object that's present. Imagining posits its object as non-existent, as absent, or as existing elsewhere. It can also neutralize itself, which is to say, not posit its object as existent. So in taking nothingness to be a characteristic of imagining and being to be a characteristic of perception, Sartre sets up a radical dichotomy between two different relations to its object. So in a sense, each opens out onto a different world. As such, Sartre notes that when I have an image of Pierre, I do not simply mean that I don't see Pierre, but also that I don't see anything at all. Now, as we'll see, once again, when we look at Sartre's account of our relationship to the world, at the heart of Sartre's account of how nothingness functions is going to be something very close to Bergson's own understanding of nothingness. Okay, the final characteristic of imagining is that whereas perception is felt to be something undertaken, we feel that imagining carries with it a certain spontaneity. So if I imagine a cube, I'm free to manipulate it to change its position instantaneously, but when I perceive a cube, I have to wait upon perception itself to unfold the different moments. Right. So what we can see from this analysis, I think, is that even with the rejection of Bergson's theory of consciousness, the distinction at the heart of Bergson's thought between two kinds of multiplicity is central to Sartre's account of the imagination. Bergson provides the difference in kind that allows Sartre to clearly distinguish imagining acts from perception. And in doing so, Sartre follows Bergson in associating discrete multiplicities with a break from nature. The failure to emphasize Bergson's place in Sartre's account of the imagination, I think, has led to a failure to see Bergsonism, see the role it plays in Sartre's mature thought. So what I want to do in the next section is see how all that stuff plays out in terms of being and nothingness. Okay. So being and nothingness presents Sartre's existential phenomenology in detail, and it outlines the worldview. The outlines of this worldview are already present in the work on the imaginary. So we've seen that the imagination is a faculty that provides rules for relating to absent objects, and to see how this might constitute what Sartre calls a situation, we can briefly mention one of Sartre's most famous examples, and that's Pierre's absence from the cafe. So Sartre gives the following summary of the situation. I have an appointment with Pierre at 4 o'clock. I arrive at the cafe a quarter of an hour late. Typical Sartre. Pierre is always punctual. Will he have waited for me? I look at the room, the patrons, and I say, he is not here. So as Sartre notes, when we're looking around the cafe at first appears to be a fullness of being. It's just full of sights and sounds and actions. Now, in order to perceive an object, for Sartre, we don't just need the object itself, but we also need the background against which it's going to be perceived. So when we look around the cafe for Pierre, then, as our gaze moves from object to object, people and things raise themselves from the ground of the cafe to become an object of attention, and then they fall back into the background as another object takes their place. Now, eventually, we realise that Pierre is not in the cafe. Now, Sartre's claim is that we perceive the absence of Pierre concretely against the background of the fullness of the cafe. So when we say Pierre is not in the cafe, this absence is manifested prior to the claim we're making. So the concrete absence is very different from what would happen if we said the Duke of Wellington is not in the cafe. That would just be a linguistic assertion. But Pierre is very much not in the cafe. It's a concrete sense. So there are a number of implications of this account. First, it's the failure of the world to meet our expectations, which allows nothingness to be introduced into the world, even if this nothingness is nonetheless a real existence. So Sartre says elsewhere that destruction relies on the existence of unities that we've posited. It's man who destroys his cities through the agencies of earthquakes, or directly who destroys his ships through the agency of cyclones. Because without our giving significance to a certain unity of matter as a city or a ship, all we would have is an indifferent movement of one form of matter to another form of matter. So once we posit the significance of the possibility of the destruction, the negation of an object, nothingness becomes an objective fact. Fragility has been impressed upon the very being of this vase, and its destruction would be an irreversible absolute event which I could only verify. So as Sartre notes in the imaginary of being and nothingness, both of these texts, the relationship between nothingness and expectation coincides with Bergson's own account of nothingness. So in Creative Evolution, Bergson argues similarly that negation enters the world only when we find our practical aims thwarted by circumstances. So Bergson says, the idea of annihilation is not a pure idea. It implies that we regret the past, or that we conceive it as regrettable, that we have some reason to linger over it. Suppress all interest, all feeling, and there is nothing left but the reality that flows together with the knowledge, ever renewed, that it impresses on us of its present state. So for Bergson, nothingness is a function of our expectations not being fulfilled by the world. And for Bergson, it's illusory. Nothingness is illusory. But the key difference, I think, between Bergson and Sartre here is that for Sartre, ontology begins with phenomenology. And so nothingness, in a sense, has a degree of validity that's similar to other things we experience, whereas Bergson is working within a larger metaphysical framework, which sort of displaces the value of consciousness. Second, we should note that what Sartre is providing in the cafe example is a theory of the constitution of a meaningful world. That's what he calls a situation. The elements and people within the cafe take on their significance in terms of the absence of Pierre. So it's the fact that they're the background for his lack of presence that forms the cafe into a unity. In this instance, what's constituted is a set of relations between objects. But in Being and Nothingness, Sartre becomes a bit more radical and argues that not only are relations between objects constituted by the introduction of negation into the world, but the world of objects itself that we relate to is constituted in this manner. So practical engagements structure the situations we find ourselves in. And I think here we come to what's probably the most significant ethical difference between Sartre and Bergson. So for Bergson too, it's our practical engagements that structure our everyday understanding of the world. So we've evolved to translate and extract from the world those features that are most needed for our survival. So in Matter and Memory, Bergson suggests that the constitution of a situation in this term occurs at the level of species. So Bergson says, imagine a rudimentary consciousness such as that of an amoeba in a drop of water. It will be sensible of the resemblance and not the difference in the various organic substances which it can assimilate. In short, we can follow from the mineral to the plant, from the plant to the simplest conscious beings, from the animal to man, the progress of the operation by which things and being seize from their surroundings that which attracts them, that which interests them practically, without needing any effort of abstraction, simply because the rest of their surroundings take no hold upon them. This similarity of reaction following actions superficially different is the germ with which human consciousness develops its general ideas. So Matter and Memory presents a more sophisticated account than Time and Free Will, but in both cases what Bergson's really concerned with is the notion of freedom. So Bergson argues that when the question of free will or determinism is posed in spatial terms, it becomes impossible to answer. And that's because the dynamic nature of consciousness is set aside and we no longer deal with the process of deliberation. So it's concerned with the trajectory of a completed movement and not the movement itself. So the process of creation remains outside of its remit. So in representing our thought processes in spatial terms, we falsify the conception of deliberation. All difficulty arises from the fact that both parties, the supporters of free will and determinism, picture the deliberation under the form of an oscillation in space, while it really consists in a dynamic progress in which the self and its motives, like real living beings, are in a constant state of becoming. So freedom for Bergson has a Spinozistic edge. It's about recovering this kind of deeper notion of self. So if it's for Bergson a return to understanding the world in terms of a confused multiplicity, for Sartre, freedom is instead tied to viewing the world as structured in terms of our practical concerns. Since the basis of our projects is something that's absent from the world, and this irreal object gives meaning to our world, then we've got a certain degree of freedom, as different choices of a real object are possible. As our project involves transcending the present, then the meaning of our past and present will be determined by future projects. So as he says, who shall decide whether that mystic crisis in my 15-year was a pure accident of puberty, or on the contrary, the first sign of a future conversion? I myself, according to whether I decide at 20 years of age, at 30 years, to be converted. So the introduction of the irreal object into the constitution of the world leads to a transformation of this central theme of Bergson's account of constitution. For Bergson, the reason why the organism determines the world as a set of discrete entities is to allow us to engage with it practically. By articulating the world as discrete systems, we're able to disregard those aspects of our environment that are indifferent for our form of life. For Bergson, the differences in the way the same object is conceived operate at the level of species. So different forms of life will extract different features from their environment. Sartre's approach mirrors Bergson's, but rather than see our situation organised according to the practical concerns of species, it's organised by the practical concerns of the individual's project. So there's a kind of reversal of Bergson's account of freedom here. For Bergson, it's in recognising the value of the deep self that we're free. For Sartre, on the contrary, freedom is tied to the power of the imaginary to institute a radical decompression of being, fragmenting the inherent unity of the world into a field of pragmatic and instrumental relations. So just as for Bergson, counting cuts up the world in an arbitrary manner, just as that's the case for Bergson, the imagination for Sartre is free to determine the divisions which give sense to a situation, and thus, while my actions are determined by my situation is open to radical revision. So the situation isn't tied to the species for Sartre, or even to the individual, but to the specific project of the individual. And that's a project that's open to rejection and substitution at any moment. In this respect, for Sartre, as well as for Bergson, there's a certain determinism associated with seeing the world from within our practical considerations. But for Sartre, there's a moment of freedom in the recognition that other situations are possible, whereas for Bergson, since situations are tied to the species, it's only a movement back to a pure pre-practical self that offers the possibility of freedom. So the central category of being and nothingness there, the situation, is both constituted by us and is an organisation of the given, and it can be traced back to this notion of Bergson's two multiplicities. Following Bergson, it's human beings who introduce negation into the world, and it's human beings who organise their relations to the world according to practical concerns. But by understanding practical concerns and operating on the level of the individual rather than the species, what for Bergson is a form of determinism becomes for Sartre a moment of freedom. So the origin of situation in Bergson's thought, I think, explains partly why freedom remains so ambivalent for Sartre. So the discontinuity of the discrete multiplicity allows for a restructuring of the world, but I think it still retains for Sartre some of Bergson's sense of practical consciousness as something that's alienated and unable to coincide with being. All right, just to conclude then, Sartre rejects central aspects of Bergson's thought, but we can see that throughout his early and middle periods, even in his rejection of Bergson, his philosophical development is orientated according to the axes of Bergson's argument, distinctions and descriptions. In developing his positive philosophy, he takes up Bergson's arguments against his predecessors and breaks with him only through the introduction of intentionality. So even here, Bergson's descriptions of consciousness are preserved, albeit on the understanding that they emerge from a natural illusion. His model of imagination, which sees it as a synthesis that differs in kind from the synthesis of perception, is explicitly formulated in accordance with Bergson's distinction of two kinds of multiplicities. Similarly, Sartre's account of freedom involves an inversion of Bergson's understanding of the practical and the durational, seeing freedom in the constitution of a situation rather than the evasion of one. Now, recognising these aspects of Sartre's thought, I think, allows it to engage with more recent Bergsonians such as Gilles Deleuze. In the Logic of Sense, published in 1969, Deleuze calls Sartre's transcendence of the ego decisive in specifying the conditions for a transcendental field that doesn't rely on a unifying ego. Now, the affinities between Sartre and Deleuze are perhaps even more strongly visible in the latter's collaborations with Guattari. So shortly after Sartre's death, Deleuze gave a brief essay on Sartre to the Sartre scholar Jeanette Colombel that makes clear the connection between the situation and Sartre's own work. Here, Deleuze talks of Sartre's inaugurating a third moment in phenomenology. So after Hegel and Husserl, there's what he calls a pragmatic phenomenology, and he gives the following definition of Sartre's situation. The situation is not a concept amongst others for Sartre, but the pragmatic element that transforms everything and without which concepts would have neither sense nor structure. A concept has neither structure nor sense until it is put into a situation. The situation is the operation of the concept itself, and the richness and novelty of Sartrean concepts comes from this, that they are expressions of situation, and at the same time that situations are assemblages of concepts. Now, I think Deleuze's introduction of the term assemblage is crucial here, because he's signalling a parallel between Sartre's thought and a central moment in his later philosophy, and also through the move beyond sense to pragmatism. So in 1000 Plateaus, an assemblage is an emergent unity formed by a collection of heterogeneous bodies. And in this sense, it correlates with Sartre's concept of a situation as a synthesis of facticity into a unified field. So Deleuze is here equating the formation of a situation with a movement in territorialization. More than this shared pragmatism, we find in Deleuze and Guattari the same kind of logic of multiplicities that we find in Sartre. So 1000 Plateaus is a work of process philosophy, and we can see that the formation of assemblages, thanks Dave, as the organisation of processes into relations between bodies. So just as Sartre develops his own account of the constitutive role of the imagination in terms of the move from a continuous to a discrete multiplicity, Deleuze and Guattari explicitly map the process of the constitution of systems of bodies from a series of intensive processes onto the Bergsonian categories of continuous and discrete multiplicities. So just as continuous and discrete multiplicities are central for Sartre, they write that in Bergson there's a distinction between numerical multiplicities and qualitative multiplicities. We are doing approximately the same thing when we distinguish between arborescent multiplicities and rhizomatic multiplicities. So obviously there are substantial differences between Sartre and Deleuze, notably around the relationships between consciousness and synthesis. But their shared affinities point to the possibility of reading Sartre himself as a corrective to Deleuze and Guattari, or conversely the other way around. And we can read Sartre as developing this logic of multiplicities in a way that reasserts his place as an important interlocutor with more modern continental philosophies, but also potentially reinforces Sartre's place as a critic of these modern approaches too. So as such, reincorporating the Bergsonian moment into Sartre's thought, I think allows us to see him more than simply a shit Heideggerian. Okay, thank you.